So here we go. This is Buried in Treasure, chapter 12. So we're coming down to I would say the last furlong. We're at the just at the finishing point. We're getting right into that maintenance stage where we'll be looking at how we maintain the progress we've made so far and really assess how far we've come. So it's really an opportunity to really assess and take a look at how things have gone so far. But we're glad that we're at this point. So as you know, Buried in Treasure learning community is really designed to support people addressing hoarding behaviors in the different facets of the service arenas that we provide. And it certainly is adaptable. Most of the principles and practices are adaptable to different environments. Hope so far you've been getting the most out of the both the learning application and the information I shared, and your opportunity to share with your colleagues across different agencies and services, and to see how things are done in the different arena and see what's common and what can be adapted in your particular neck of the woods. So hope that helps. But I want to get right into it. I want to welcome you all again. Today's meeting is hosted by Washington State Healthcare Authority. And as you know, this is an interactive meeting, and we encourage you to engage as best as you can by asking questions and participating throughout the session. The slides and recording will be sent by email after the presentation. So I hope that you are, good morning, Melody. I hope that you are receiving that information. And I try my best to kind of get it to you as early as possible, but Washington's DBHR is ultimately responsible for getting that to your specific agency. So I hope that's happening. So let's look again at the learning community schedule. Like I said, we have transitioned from session 1, where we were just being introduced to what is hoarding, to the point where we are now looking at, you know, the bad guys, really taking on your brain. That's probably today's session is going to be really about perceptions and beliefs and how that either supports or impedes your progress in making those changes, those behavioral changes, and thus attitudinal and processing changes to get you to the point where you're actively involved in that sorting and organizing and decision-making process to really see some tangible evidence. You know, we're in that action phase of change, and we're looking at how those desires and needs are being met to really formulate and to establish an environment that's functional for us, and one that we can not only live in a meaningful, positive light, but certainly have some level of control over what comes in, what goes out, and what kind of environment is set up in that way. So subsequent to this week, next week will be next month, as a matter of fact, and my apologies for that, will be it seems like the days are just going by. So when I said next week, I realized we're in December next week. So it's kind of stunning to me. But that's great ultimately. I think most of us want to get through 2022 and get to some other state of affairs next year. Hopefully it's a lot better than where we've been, right? At least that's my perception. I don't want to impose that on someone else. But yes, next month we will be culminating with really looking at how we have maintained the success and what are some of the strategies and instruments we put in place to ensure that we continue to thrive in that area and maintain the success we have achieved so far. So we're really getting down to the nitty-gritty, so to speak. So let's do our usual housekeeping. The reminder, certainly, in your participation, you can use the chat to raise your hand, and we'll have that discussion. You can download the chat as well, and we'll talk about that as we go through. So because you have to wait until the entire session is completed so you can get the full element of the chat. You really go to those 3 dots on your toolbar, and you'll press save chat, and it will give you that option. It's right across from where the smiley face is, you'll see the three dots. You can press there and save the chat, and you'll get the entire chat sent to the email that you register for the training with. So we'll talk some more at the end of the session about that, so you can retrieve that. I've provided you with the call-in information in the event that you have audio challenges and you need to call in. We ask that you keep yourself muted to reduce the background noise, and you certainly can use your video. And if you're doing so, please be reminded to maintain that kind of professional appearance and standard. So please note that subtitling and the captions are available to you. You go once again to the same three dots, and you can go down and press and look at subtitling option or caption option and you can certainly activate that caption option, and you'll have that available to you for those who may need it. So if there's any questions about subtitling option, just kindly let me know, and I will certainly take you through the paces. And please be reminded that this session is indeed being recorded, and want to make sure that people are aware of that. So let's first of all take a review of what we have done last month, and give me a sense as to how people have whether practiced or had an opportunity to look at that. So from the October meeting on Here Come the Bad Guys, Motivating and Working Time, we focused on that. Want to ask if people have had the opportunity to either share or utilize the clutter visualization exercise or the unclutter visualization exercise. And how did that go? How did you find it? Was it helpful? Was it challenging? Did you have the opportunity to use it? So we can start there. What I would certainly ask is if you've had the opportunity to utilize the clutter or the unclutter visualization exercise or the downward arrow, if you can just indicate yes or no and give me a sense as to where you are, because I don't want to necessarily repeat the same information or expand upon it if you've already kind of practiced that. But give me a yes or no if you've had the opportunity to do the review in terms of utilizing those particular exercises. Okay, so I've seen some yes, no, not yet, which is common, and that's absolutely fine. Oh, Kelly, well, I'm glad for you. Your new job. I hope it goes well so far. It's going well so far, and future's bright in that regard. Sarah Lynn says, I've been sharing your resource with my clinical staff. I'm hoping that it's really part of your developmental toolkit that you use, part of your skill set, and you share as much as possible, because obviously I know, given the current staffing circumstance, not everyone is able to attend the training, but I certainly want the material and information to be shared so that we can all really augment and optimize our skill set, particularly in this area of need and this area of service. So I'm assuming that a number of folks haven't had the chance yet, but I encourage you, as I usually do, to practice as best as you can, because as we know, the best way to make the most out of a learning material or learning opportunity is to really practice it in the field, in that real, authentic, unique environment where it's going to be utilized, and to get some feedback so that we can provide and share some feedback as to how you were able to operationalize it. Did it work? Was it adaptable to your environment? So we can guide you as to what may be an alternative if you haven't done so yet. So Debbie says, yes, I'm glad that you have, and we have some folks who have. So for those who have tried it, can you give me some sense as to how did that work? Was it challenging? Did you find it helpful? How did you adapt it to your particular environment? Go ahead, Debbie.
Did you want us to just put our comments in the chat?
No, I want to hear your lovely voice.
Okay.
You're already there. Absolutely.
Well, I'm actually, even though my name says I'm in San Diego, that's where I live. but I'm visiting my sister and her family in Portland, Oregon. So I'm
Nice.
using my laptop, but I forgot my mouse. So it's taking me a little bit longer to respond and so forth. But anyway,
Yes.
I have in the past been working with the clutter hoarding program called CREST in San Diego. So before then, I've been trying to declutter, especially my second bedroom, which because I don't have a garage, it's kind of like my big storage area. But I would like to have my second bedroom be a guest bedroom. And maybe my great niece, who I'm visiting in Portland, might come to school down in San Diego and she might live with me. So I have motivation to really clean this room up, but it's been hard. And I'm probably one of the oldest people taking this course. I'm 72 years old. And the CREST program, which was the clutter hoarding program at UCSD and the county of San Diego, we dealt with people 60 years and older. And it just goes, it makes sense. The longer you live and the more money you have, you can buy more stuff. And it becomes a problem in older age because a lot of people will be scaling down to smaller places like independent living or, you know, just different circumstances in life. And so it's kind of hard for us to get rid of things that are attached to fond memories of our life. And so anyway, I've been, you know, this course has really helped me personally. And I think I've helped others because I've been sharing some of the key, you know, tips, so to speak. And like right now, the place where I'm visiting with my sister, she doesn't realize she's a hoarder. She considers herself a collector and she's a watercolor painter. So, you know, anyway,
You're hitting on some,
it's ongoing. It's
absolutely.
ongoing.
But you hit some main points, and we'll talk about some of those elements today. You know, from the attachment to materials and possessions, to the way we identify with our possessions, and oftentimes to the challenges with moving from intent and motivation to action and really putting it into a scope of seeing things, you know, change in the desired way we have. And I'm glad for you. So I'm hoping that today's session really lends some more expansive information on the how and the why, so that we can kind of motivate you. But I'm glad that you can join us there, babe.
And the other thing I wanted to say is what I do, and I think it is helpful to me, is I have an empty box in that room. And when I find something that I don't need anymore, I put it in the box for Goodwill. And so I try and do that weekly to get it out of the place.
Get that exercise muscles going, right? Get that going if you get into it. So we'll talk some more, but thank you so much for sharing. And I wanted to respond to Briar. I know for a number of people who may be joining in the midst of it or in the middle of it and may not have started from the commencement. The good news is that Washington is once again going to renew the contract for us to do it. So we'll restart this next year. I think it starts sometime in February. So I'm hoping that helps, because I know for a number of folks, it's kind of tough if you haven't started from the commencement. But we will go through the whole process again. So that will hopefully help folks. So you can join from the beginning, from the ones that you missed. So bravo, bravo. So that's great. I just want to make sure that, you know, give people a chance to give me some feedback as to whether or not they've had the opportunity to try some of it. Oh, Natasha, yes, there is certainly, and we use a particular text, the Buried in Treasure, second edition. So I hope that folks are able to get it. What I try to do is to make sure that the session has most of the elements of the book chapter by chapter, so that if you're not able to acquire the book, you can still kind of follow along the essence of the processes that the book lay out, and we try to bring some additional references and information and sources into it to really augment the Buried in Treasure book. But yes, most of the sessions are really through the guide of the Buried in Treasure, chapter by chapter, so we give people kind of a path, a predictable path to follow in terms of information and guidance. So great. So Sarah Lynn said, I did some decluttering in my garage recently. My husband kept leaving bags of grass, seed, fertilizer, plant soil, and other lawns along the way, which is on the driver's side of my car. So I could imagine. So I found a way to store these items in a bin on the shelving unit in our garage. It's stored to get it out of the way. So we're hoping today, like I said, to really get into the concepts of how the way we think, what we believe, really drive our feeling and behavior that really either supports, making some good decisions about sorting stuff, or supports us just hanging on to stuff with the hope that somehow it impacts our lives in a way we see it. But we'll talk about that. I kind of want to make sure that we take it step by step so we don't get ahead of ourselves. But I already see most of you are already kind of on path and on track for what we should be discussing today. So that's great news. Fantastic. So just like I said before, if you haven't tried some of the learning tools as yet and the learning, please try it as best as you can. It really gives you a good sense as to how you see the skills, the knowledge, and resources being applied in the field, in the manner in which you work, whether it's for your personal benefits or for your provision of services to people who are dealing with hoarding and cluttering challenges. So today's learning objective, and I want to give us a framework for what we are doing today, is really examining unhealthy beliefs about your possession and devising ways to limit their hindering effects. So it's really looking, I know we spent a lot of time in the other chapters looking at the behaviors, and how we may be able to shift and change those behaviors. Today, we're kind of taking a step, not a step back, but really taking a step into the framework for which for what drives our behavior. Those beliefs and those thoughts and those feelings that really drive our behaviors, what the focus is of today. And hopefully you get a sense as to how, if we have a modification or a shift, a paradigm shift in those feelings and thoughts and beliefs, it will really not only change our behavior and impact the way we see things and the way we operate in the world, but it would support us maintaining those behaviors that are beneficial to us, as well as recognizing the way overthinking and confusing ourselves really impedes sorting and discarding. Because whether we know it or not, in many instances, we really get into making too much of our process, our thought processes, and we really overthink things. It really gets down into one of those slippery slopes where we start this process of thinking away, and before we know it, we're way down the road and it avalanches. So we're really kind of getting a sense of where do we start to check our thoughts, challenge those thoughts, and how that may impact our ability to really move from what stagnates us to really what should drive our behavior. And ultimately, we want to point out the right skills needed to address the bad guys that we're focusing on today, 4 and 5. So we really want to get a sense of what skills do we need to have? What skills do we need to develop? What skills do we need to practice? What skills do we need to augment and sharpen and maintain? So that's the goals, the objectives for today. So let's get right into it. I think more than anything else, it's really to have a good understanding and a grasp of really understanding we're in the action stage of change. At least that's where we ought to be. And it really drives the action, what we do, really impacts our way of gauging whether we're in the right direction or not, whether we're making progress, and how our world is being shaped and defined by what we do, and how that impacts our environment, our physical environment. So I really love Steve Maraboli concept of taking action. His concept of an inch of movement will bring you closer to your goals than a mile of intentions. You know, it seems paradoxical, but it's true. You know, because I think every one of us that recognizes, first of all, that we have a problem with hoarding, typically that is followed by an intent to make some kind of change, to improve our circumstance, to change our environment. But as we know, intentions alone cannot get us to where we want to be. We have to really parlay those intentions into practices and behaviors and changes that really make tangible changes for us. So it's important to get a sense of that. You know, we can drag a bag of intentions into a room. It is not going to change the nature of that room if you don't take some action. And it may seem kind of basic and simple, but it's really impactful in that sense, to keep that message in your mind. Because I've heard people, you know, across all the environments we've provided stuff, say, I really intended to, or I have the right intentions. And I always said, a lot of things that are not functional are paved with good intentions. But we have to walk the road of action to get to where we need to get. And as you know me, I am all about the analogies, because I believe people tend to remember things once it is formulated in an analogy, because you can connect with it. So I like to kind of lay that out. And in some instances, you know, it works. In some instances, it doesn't. Some people just like facts. Or don't give me the stories. I just want the facts. I'm okay with doing that. So it's important, as we recognize we're in the stage of action, how do we maintain in this stage? You know, and that's important for us to get a good sense of what do we need to do to make sure that we are maintaining in the action stage. As you know, we really focus on that stage of change concept and model, that trans-theoretical model that Pacheska and De Clemente really pioneered. And what we know is in the stages of change that really defines action, that really drives action, there are some strategies and approaches that are in many ways rooted in the foundation of that action, of maintaining in the action stage. And the first of that is really that counter conditioning. And someone would ask, certainly, what does that mean? You know, what does counter conditioning really refer to? It's really substituting, you know, the healthy behaviors and thoughts, you know, it's really looking at the thoughts and behaviors that are either healthy or unhealthy, and really making sure that we are shifting them and making sure we're countering those concepts. So if we have unhealthy behaviors, we need to counter them with healthier behaviors and thoughts. So the thoughts and behaviors that really drive functional, efficacious kind of action is what we're going to be focused on in the action stage. And then the reinforcement management concept or strategy is really about rewarding those positive behaviors and reducing rewards that come from negative behaviors. So it's really putting the carrot in the right place, ensuring that we are really acknowledging, recognizing, and rewarding those positive behaviors, and not necessarily rewarding those negative ones that keep us holding on to stuff. Then finally, that concept of really that stimulus control. And it's really about how does our environment really speak to us, and that re-engineering the environment to have reminders and cues that support and encourage the healthy behavior and remove those that encourage the unhealthy one. So really imparting in our environment those cues and reminders for us to facilitate and sustain those positive behaviors, and the cues that really help us recognize and discourage us from engaging in those unhealthy behaviors. And we'll talk some more about that. But this is kind of the framework. These are kind of the approaches and strategies and philosophies and paradigm that really help us maintain in the action phase. And I wanted to make sure that we were aware of those concepts. And some may be familiar to you and some may not be. but that's absolutely fine. So it's really about making sure that we are feeding the healthy behaviors. We are fostering them, we are supporting them, we're cueing them in, we're providing reminders. It's about rewarding those behaviors. And it's really about ensuring that our environment establishes visually, psychologically, emotionally, the cues that really help us sustain those healthy behaviors. And in many ways, address the negative behaviors and really keep them out of our frame of reference. So as we always do, we really look at what kind of interventions and strategies do we adapt for that particular stage of change, because we want to make sure that stage-wise, we are using the appropriate, the tested, the validated interventions that will help us in our efforts to either promote healthy behaviors and the change for ourselves, or to actually support someone in that particular stage of change as they address their concerns. So when we look at the action stage, and that's what we're focused on, we're talking about making the change and living the new behaviors, which oftentimes is all consuming. That's why we talk about you have to do a minimum of an hour each day to see those tangible changes. And in this particular stage of change, we want to focus on building those skills, and we'll talk about the right skills. We want to make sure that we're getting the right kind of social support that promotes us sustaining those healthy behaviors, that we can reach out to ensure that we are reminded and given the cues for doing the right thing, engaging in the productive behaviors. And then we want to make sure that we're able to have that cognitive behavioral kind of concept. So when we talk about it, we want to ensure that we have a sense as to how our thoughts and our feelings are driving our behavior, and vice versa. You know, how those behaviors are really oftentimes a product of how we think and how we feel. So we want to make sure that we have that triumphant in the right order, and they're working in a smooth kind of operation. So it's just a reminder as to what we are doing, what we're expecting to do, what it should look like in the action phase, what are some of the tools and approaches and strategies we should be using, and why. Because they're evidence-based. They've been supported by the evidence. They've been practiced in the field, in the real environment, and people have shown the positive kind of outcomes from them. So that's a reminder to kind of keep in mind what we do and what kind of approaches we adapt in a specific stage of change, so that we're not either pushing people too far, pushing ourselves too far too quickly, and we're adapting the right approach to the right stage of change. Where we are, we need to make sure that our interventions are appropriate for where we are. Any questions there? So we kind of always make sure that we set up that framework. We have an understanding as to where we are in terms of the stage of change, what we're striving to do, what's driving what we do, and how it really reflects the intent and the plan to make those changes happen. So we're in the action stage. We want to make sure we're driven by actions. So the first concept I want to think of is the belief system that drives a lot of our behavior. And it's important for us to make sure that we are conscious and cognizant of the behaviors or the beliefs, first of all, that can impede progress. So letting unhealthy beliefs about your possession getting your way is a major, major challenge and reality for people who are challenged with hoarding issues or concerns. The beliefs are really profound and strong and demonstrative and really guide a lot of our behavior. We need to discern quickly and consistently whether those behaviors, those beliefs are really healthy and productive for us, and therefore promotes and feed the right action. So when we think of unhealthy beliefs, and we'll go through some of them, what they look like, how they manifest, we want to make sure we're checking in with ourselves. What is really going through your mind right now when you have a belief that may be impacting or impeding your progress? And I always say a good sign to know when you are in that state is when you start to experience emotional reactions to whether it's a conversation or to the presence or absence of a possession, when you begin to react emotionally in a way that either you hear from the folks that care about you and know you, it seems irrational, or it's exaggerated, or it's out of place. When you feel like those emotions are really heightened and beyond where they need to be, it's important to get a sense that a belief system is really driving an unhealthy behavior here. And that's important to note. So we'll look at some of those beliefs, those unhealthy beliefs, or those beliefs that drive unhealthy behavior. And they're very definitive and clear. Beliefs about usefulness of an item or a possession. Perfectionism and the fear of making a mistake, when we are literally immobilized by the fear of making a mistake. Beliefs about responsibility. Beliefs about objects as a source of identity. When we have that profound belief that this particular item defines who I am and how I see myself in the world, it's critical. And I think Debbie alluded to it, and we'll talk some more about it. When you have someone who's holding on to painting materials, 15 easels, 500 brushes, 18 gallons of water paint, and every instrument possible, that really speaks to the fact that that person sees themselves as an artist and wants the world to see them as an artist. That's when we begin to establish that concept of, we truly believe that our possessions define who we are, gives us an identity. If I have all these painting materials, people would assume, and I would feel like I am an artist, right? It's just natural. If you have the tools and the things that you need, it's easy to see yourself being identified by that. But we'll talk some more about, there's a step that you're missing. And oftentimes people get blockaded or stagnated or stopped at the initial step and never get into the process. So we'll talk some more clearly about what that looks like. And I agree, Melody, we talk about a good way to getting rid of easy. It is amazing how much we acquire and how we don't always notice until we have to move. Yes, moving is probably one of the most, instrumental way of really reassessing where we are in terms of our possession. Then we talk about beliefs about control. When we find ourselves working so hard to control an environment that we feel is out of control, and we're holding on to items to demonstrate our control, and how much that can have almost the opposite impact of what we're striving for. So these are the beliefs, what oftentimes is deemed unhealthy or unproductive, that drives those behaviors that are similar, unproductive, unhealthy behaviors. So anyone familiar with this belief system or these systems of beliefs that really impact our functioning and our behavior? I know, I can tell you from my own experience, I've held on to some possessions with the idea that somehow that stuff defines me. It's one of those things where I had this home gym and I've got more dumbbells than the law allows because to me, having these possessions really gives me a definition or a feeling that I'm a person that is interested in fitness and staying healthy. Now, whether or not I use those dumbbells and make sure that I'm actually engaging in fitness-oriented stuff is another question. So in many regards, I found myself kind of defeating my own intentions of defining myself through my possessions. And I had to stop and just reassert, okay, Earl, if you've got more than 10 dumbbells, you're really not working because you don't need 10 dumbbells to begin an exercise program, right? So it's one of those things that, and there's many different ways of seeing that. And Baby says, yes, my dad has tools he'll never use because one day it may be useful. And we'll talk about that as well. It's so profound. And you'll see a lot of, either see the things that are in yourself or in others through these examples and discourse. And Corey says, yes, this makes me see my husband holding on to all of his old sports items that he sees himself. Yep. Holding on to that image of myself in my youth, in my fittest, most defined way. I always talk about holding on to the t-shirts when you had, those defined muscles and those defined body, and just assuming that if I hold on to it, somehow I'm going to remind myself that I'm that, even though, things have not worked out that way. But that's kind of one of those things. My husband has sweaters from the 80s. Oh, yes, absolutely. There's lots of reminders of that, but it has a purpose and a sense, and it's not outlandish. It's just not productive in many regards, and we'll talk some more as to why that is. So beliefs about usefulness. This is probably the most common one, because we all see utility in the things we possess. It starts out oftentimes when you hear someone says, I could probably fix this up and use it, and it would be a shame to waste it, right? You hold on to that old clock, that old scissors, that old wrench, a long list of things, and you said, I'm going to fix it one day, I'm going to oil it up, and some WD-40 on that, and it'll be right back to its, ready-made first day elements. And oftentimes that gets more than simply just small tools. For some people, they hold on to large items. This is one of those things where you see people holding on, if they have the space and room, to cars that they're going to fix up one day. I'm going to customize, and it's worth $60,000. Why would I not put the energy into updating that old Chevy from 77? And it's been there 10 years. Grass is growing out of it, and we still have that image of, when it has this custom leather seat and I'm driving it or I'm selling it, I will remember these days. Fortunately, it seldom gets to that point where that's happening. But that's where it starts. Remember when you were thinking through items in chapter 10 and sorting and removing stuff and making those decisions? You ask yourself that oftentimes, is your need for this item as distinct as your brain tells you? So what we suggest here when we are faced with that dilemma or that challenge is to really ask yourself some questions to help you think through that process. The concept of the usefulness. Do I have a specific plan to use this item within a reasonable time frame? Have I used this item in the past year? Have you really used that wrench from the time you got it from your grandfather's grandfather? Have you really ever used it? How does this compare with a thing I value highly? Is this tent clock, that's an old English clock that doesn't tell the time anymore, you don't know whether or not it has all the parts, do you really highly value it in your current state of affairs? Will having this item help me solve my hoarding problem? The ultimate question. And those are tough questions, but they're realistic questions you need to be asking yourself. And oftentimes I suggest to people, have those questions written up on a little form with beautiful highlights so you can see it from afar, or you can read it. I often have a client of mine that says, I have it written early, it's on the refrigerator. And then I need a binoculars to read it because it's not written legibly, or it's not written where you can read it. It's not going to be meaningful if you can't read it, right? You want to be able to look at it quickly and remind yourself, oops, have I used this in the past year? It should be clear and defined there. And if you haven't, you have a sense as to what's going on. And that's going to be important. And Natasha says that's the hardest for me. Having lived with all my my life with low income, I still have my 16 years old baby clothes because I want more kids and everything is, is expensive. I'll use the clothes when I have more kids. So things I have started to give away, I can also do so because I know someone else I'm giving it to needs it. We'll talk about that. And that's understandable, Natasha. It's more common than you could imagine, you know, and we'll talk about what drives those feelings and how, what kind of behavior they lead to, and how you can really mitigate those beliefs and really find a more functional way, because there's a lot more that it takes than, you know, really looking at the usefulness of that material. But it's understandable. Nothing is wrong with that. So it's important to get from, am I really using it, as opposed to simply saying it can be useful. So what we suggest here is really thinking of the advantages and disadvantages of maintaining this item. And we use the advantage and disadvantage worksheet in this element. You know, think about the advantages and the disadvantages of saving the item, as well as the advantages and disadvantages of letting it go. Then write them down and see if the list helps you tip in the scale in favor of letting it go. That's the first element and the first approach that we ask you to take. Really go through that list of stuff that you have. Use the advantage, disadvantage worksheet and see whether the scales are tipped in one direction or not. I always say when you do that, if you don't have the disadvantage, advantages worksheet, just get a legal pad and put a line down the middle and put on one side advantages of maintaining it, and the other side advantages or disadvantages of letting it go. And really look, oftentimes the scales will tell you. You see that list top heavy on one side or profoundly slanted on one side, it really tells you, it speaks to that already. You know, I always say, I think of it in this mode. If you hold on to all the baby clothes that you have, right, with the hope that one day I'll have this baby, or one day I can, you know, I give it to someone who can use it. I always ask, you know, that question of, do you plan to have that baby in the next year? And if the answer is, Earl, are you crazy? I can barely afford, you know, doing what I do right now. I don't know about having the baby in the next year, but maybe the next 3 years. I always think of it. There are so many people who are having a baby right now, where it's happening, that can use that material right now, that will see you as an angel sent down from the heavens if you can offer them some of those items right now. And I always say the slip of negotiation, whereas if you give, and there's some elements where there's some baby material exchange, kind of a swap meet. So if you give, you always are actually permitting yourself to be on the receiving end when your time comes. So you can join one of those swap meets or those elements where you give knowing fully well, Earl, if I give out my 10 thing, at what point when I need it, am I going to be able to get? Yes, you can go to that same place and oftentimes be on the receiving end because they notice and they register when you actually share those things. Or you can give it knowing fully well that I can see it operationalized in someone's life meaningfully and tangibly. And I can feel good from that act of giving and making it a utility for someone else in that mode. And I always say, the reality of this is clear. Yes, some baby clothes are ubiquitous in that it will never change, right? A onesie is always going to be a onesie from now until the end of time. But the onesies from the 1980s are probably not trendy or not what babies are wearing today. So the likelihood is that you have to upgrade kind of style and material. A lot of things we've learned, even the material that created those they were created out of the 80s may not be deemed the most, you know, beneficial now because we've learned a lot. Science has evolved, you know, the kind of cotton that helps to aerate or helps to prevent lots of different things have changed. So sometimes when we hold on to things, we don't evolve with the science. And that's a way of looking at it. If we evolve with the science, we may not necessarily have the need to hold on to things because they may not be as effective as they were in that time when they were created. So it's important to understand the beliefs about usefulness can keep us stymied, keep us restricted in our movement. And we don't necessarily have to hold on to things because they are deemed useful. The reality is, if we're not using them, they are not useful. It's shifting from they can be useful to they are useful or they're not. And the best way to go about that is really asking yourself those firm questions that we talked about in chapter 9, and then really looking at the advantage disadvantage scale and see if it's slanting you towards really letting go of those stuff. So that's an important element. So really use the advantage disadvantages worksheet. It's helpful in that regard. And I'll make sure that you have it. I'll put it into the chat in a bit so you can have that if you don't currently have it. Any questions there? Great. So if you have a question as to, Earl, is this the best approach? Or how do I see myself? How do I really recognize this particular feeling and its impediment? And how do I shift my thoughts and the paradigm? That's what we are hoping to achieve here. Really looking at the utility and usefulness of something in the here and now, in the current, in a way that really makes your life meaningful, in a way that you value right now. Then we are, this particular element is so significant in terms of need versus want. And Sarah Lynn Edmonds says, I don't see the advantages worksheet in my list of resources. I'll make sure you get it, Sarah Lynn, and thank you for asking. I'll add it to the chat momentarily, but it's a great tool. It helps us really make that decision. The needs versus wants. This can probably be deemed as the age-old dilemma, right? What is a need versus what is a want? And I'll tell you, I will probably be able to give you 1,500 different variations of this definition. And the likelihood is that you'll still leave here thinking, I don't know if Earl really described the need versus a want clearly. It's probably the most difficult distinction to make, but it's oftentimes a great stuff to strive for, to really get an understanding as to how you make that demarcation and distinction, and we'll do our best to move in that direction. I want to make sure I'm responding. And Debbie says, I also feel like giving away items that we think we need in the future is an issue of faith in God that He will provide for my needs. And that's a great way of looking at it, if that's your frame of reference. I look back and He has provided me for in the past and thankful for all the blessings. Yes, and it's that concept of paying it forward. Sometimes when we are perceivably blessed in that way, it is important for us to share that with people who may be in a need. So need versus wants. Do you really need this item or do you just want it? Question most oftentimes are asked or imposed upon people with hoarding issues. And that's a source of it's a sore point. But the best way is to really have an understanding as to what that distinction is. So a need in this instance means that you absolutely must have it. It would be a great hardship doing without it. On the other hand, a desire or a want means that you would prefer to keep it, but you would be okay without it. And how we really help process that distinction is really asking yourself these questions. Would you die without it? And I know it may seem, outlandish or profound to be like, oh, really? You're going to ask me, would I die without this item? You have to ask yourself that question. It's as tough as it is. It's a fair, tangible question. Would my safety be impaired without it? I think of that concept of the person who holds on or maintains 12 different first aid kit. I have a particular consumer of mine who holds on to first aid kit, and we went through some of them. And the third one that came out, every single item in that first aid kit had expired. And it was sealed. It was new. It hadn't been broken. The seal hadn't been broken. We opened it and we said everything was expired. Because when you turn it up and look at it, it literally had a date of like 2019 or 2018. And I said, you are now putting your health at risk by potentially keeping this stuff with the idea that it is useful. When if you need it, it's not the best thing to use. Would your health be jeopardized without it? If you don't have this and you have a situation generally, would your health be in jeopardy? Is it critical to your work or your employment or your current living circumstances? You ask those questions, the answer should drive the way you see that item, discerning whether it's a want or a need and how you should act subsequent or related to that item. So it's really important to make that distinction and to be unafraid to ask that question when it arises, when you're faced with that dilemma. What we suggest there is really doing some work and thinking it through. So you rate your need, and there's a want versus need scale that you can use on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being no need and 10 being required to survive. You rate the item. You rate it on the scale. And to evaluate your true need is to consider its value to survival, safety, health, work, financial affairs, or recreation. Really take a look and ask yourself, is this critical and imperative to me surviving, maintaining safety, being in good health, maintaining my job, maintaining my financial elements, or really having leisure and recreation utilizing this item? After you've done so, after you've rated it on that scale of 0 to 10, you really want to re-rate it after answering the questions. So you rate it initially. You ask yourself those critical questions. You know, would your safety be impaired? Would you die without it? Is it critical to your work or employment? And then you re-rate it after asking those questions. And then you're ready to determine whether you should let it go. If you don't see a change here, if you're able to say, I don't see this as something that is critical to my survival, it's time to think of letting it go. And if you have decided, because it's not critical, it's not a true need, you can actually then make the distinction that you've changed your way of thinking as it relates to this item. It's no longer controlling you. And that is not giving up control, but taking control to make decisions about that item. So are you following that? In terms of discerning a need, a true need or a want, you go through that process of thinking it through. You actually evaluate that item in terms of its value and its need on a scale of 0 to 10. Then you actually ask yourself those critical questions. Once you've kind of sit with those answers, you then re-rate the value of this stuff in terms of a need or want on the scale. And then you make the determination as to whether or not it's time to let it go or to hold on to it because it's a need and not a want. And in doing so, you are actually taking control and exhibiting control, practicing control of your life over a possession. And Sarah Lynn says, my husband keeps way too many types of condiments, especially, and I know the condiment, I have a condiment queen that I work with. Mustards, occasionally I just have to throw out items that have expired. You know, I always think of that element of, and this may seem a little radical, where I ask folks, take all the ketchup that you have, open them, put them into a jar, and then give yourself a sense as to whether or not you're going to use that. Put it all in a single container, make it visible, and then determine how often you're going to use it. Because it's surprising how someone will have a jar of mustard in the refrigerator, but hold on to 50 different packets of it in a drawer and is seldom open. So that's it's a way of challenging the concept. So really getting past that need and want element is going to be important. So really testing it out. The question then is, we want to do an experiment with living without this item to give us a real sense as to its value. Because if you've done that and you're still having difficulty letting go after evaluating the true need of this item, try a test. Try this a test to exercise some control. What we want you to do first is put the item somewhere you can't get to it. Let's say, for example, in your car trunk, or give it to a friend to keep. Then subsequently, I want you to let it stay there for a week. So when you give it to that person, you're establishing with them that they're going to hold on to it for a week, or you put it in the car trunk for a week. And then allow that week to pass and then evaluate, examine. Did the bad outcome that you predicted actually happen? Because when you started this out, your first thought was, if I really put this stuff away, I'll likely be miserable without it. I don't know how I'm going to deal without not having this stuff in my possession. So we're testing that theory, that concept. Now, after the week has passed, and you examine whether or not the bad outcome has occurred as you predicted, you then want to really look at it, because it's unlikely that that bad outcome materializes. Yes, you may have missed the item for a while, but realize that you can live without it. And even if there's a bad outcome, let's say, for example, you are, immersed in anxiety. You ask yourself, was it difficult to recover as you predicted? Because oftentimes the prediction is not only that a bad outcome will occur if you get rid of this stuff, but you wouldn't be able to cope with that bad outcome. The reality is, once you test it out, you're able to gauge whether or not that predicted bad outcome is authentic, and whether or not you have the capacity and the ability to tolerate and to cope with that bad outcome, even if it occurs. So that's where we want you to get, in that practice mode. And the reality is, oftentimes, our prediction is not as profound as our reality once we've been able to test it out. Because the idea is to make it as if you don't have that item. So you want to gauge at the end of it, how difficult would it be to recover if the bad outcome happened, and measure it on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being the worst possible outcome, the least affected outcome as to the worst in terms of 0 to 10, and really gauge it. And you practice that until you really get a good sense as to how a particular decision about letting go really impacts you, not only in the moment, but over a period of time. And the only way you can actually feel comfortable doing this is to practice it. There's no shortcuts. So we want to look now at the fear of making mistakes, because oftentimes that's a very challenging feeling to overcome. Because yes, part of the reason why that is so challenging to overcome is because we hear consistently. The reason why we're in a state of hoarding is because we've made a series of mistakes, right? So we begin to define ourselves by people's perception of us always making mistakes and not making good judgment. So it's easy to hold on to the fear of making mistakes. So what's going to be important here is to really understand clearly that making mistakes really drive a feeling of helplessness, not being able to control the events in our lives. And it stems from what we often refer to as cognitive distortions. And there are a number of cognitive distortions that often are associated with people who hoard. All or nothing thinking, catastrophizing, Labeling. I don't know if you've heard those terms before. We've mentioned catastrophizing and the all or nothing thinking earlier in the training. You think of, if I can't figure out the perfect place to put this item, maybe I should just leave it here then, because I can't make that decision. And you know what happens with that. Leaving one item there has become 10 items, and before you know it, it's a mountain that you can't figure anything out of. But do you have to find the perfect place for this stuff in order to sort it? And we've talked about that before. If I make a mistake, I am definitely a failure. More than anything else, that is labeling. Labeling a behavior that is human to who you are as a person. You know, your behavior is not necessarily your personhood. It certainly impacts how you perceive, but it's not who you are. Making a mistake don't make you a failure. As a matter of fact, it makes you as human as you possibly should be. And Brian says it's my OCD because I can't do it perfectly 100%, then there's no reason to start. And that's a very common perception. And the reality, as I always ask people, is which one of us lives at our 100% perfect self? Precisely, right? Yes, I always say we strive for perfection, but we are imperfectly aware that we are not perfect. So it's one of those concepts. And even though it can really impact how we think and behave, I always say, if I take away the numbers or the percentage, who am I? Because the one thing you'll always be is 100% you. Nobody can take that away from you, no matter what circumstance you're in. So hold on to that element. I always say, if you're going to hold on to a percentage, it's the 100% of who you are and will always be. That's never going to change. No one can take that from you. But the cognitive distortions are very profound in many regards and really impact how we not just see ourselves and think how we behave. Think of, if I throw it away, I'll go crazy thinking about it. It's catastrophizing. You know, I think of, someone said that to me and I said, let's take a walk out of your living room to where you have your garbage can. I want you to open that can. What do you see in that can? Stuff that you have thrown away. Correct? It's the first element of reality testing. It's like, I have thrown away stuff. My life cannot go on without me throwing stuff away. It's just impossible for me to live and keep all the things that come into my life. So there is an element of reality testing in that way. And it may be simplistic, but it's a good place to kind of get a reality check. You know, you think of that perfectionism and that fear of making a mistake. During sorting, you look at an item and experience that paralysis, that paralyzing fear, worrying about making a mistake or getting the decision wrong. What if I throw something important away? How disastrous would that be? Considering this as a failure, getting down on yourself, it leads to feeling helpless and increases the risk of giving up. But it's a cognitive distortion. It's what we call your mind playing a trick on you. And you have the ability to control how you think of things and how they impact the way you feel and how they drive how you behave. And in this instance, we ask folks to use the downward arrow to help you clarify and challenge your thinking. Is it as bad as you allow yourself to think? Really challenge that behavior. So if you catch yourself doing this, really feeding into those cognitive distortions, it's time for a reality check. Give yourself permission to make a mistake. And the last time I got a response like, Earl, you have lost your mind. I make a mistake. If I make a mistake, then I destroy exactly who I am. All of who I am is lost. The reality is that true? Can you go through this entire life without making a mistake? Certainly not true. And is a mistake more a way of how you have formulated what you should do, how you should do it, and it doesn't meet that expectation, and whether that expectation is too lofty or actually unattainable is the question. Oftentimes it is seldom the act, but the expectation set upon you based on how you feel and perceive yourself in that way. But it's important to check in. Are we really feeding into cognitive distortions? Am I really in that mode? So really, the fear of making a mistake really has to start with, first of all, recognizing that mistakes are human, mistakes are part of what we do, and you will make a mistake. You can control, though, the degree to how that mistake impacts you. And understand clearly, I always say this is another analogy that I use, and Brian will say, Earl, why are you going with another analogy? But I do. It takes breaking a number of eggs to make an omelet. True? That's the one thing that's the analogy that I use. Cannot make a good omelet without breaking a number of eggs. So it's part of it's part of the human condition. It's not a failure. It's simply a judgment that's not attuned with some perception of how you think it should be. And that changes. But make sure that you're aware of whether or not you're feeding into those cognitive distortions by being aware of what they are. That black and white thinking, that catastrophizing, that labeling. You making a mistake does not doom you to being perceived as a failure. It's a mistake. And a downward arrow really helps you discern and clarify and challenge those thinkings and thoughts. So make sure you are utilizing that too. So let's test it out. Because I always say, it's one thing for me to say, this is the way it is. I want you to test it out for yourself. Gauge your own way of seeing it and operating in that world. Let's make a small mistake purposefully. Now, those two words are a little contradictory, right? Mistake and purposeful. They sound contradictory, but in this case, we want them to be contradictory. We want them to really give you a sense of challenging the perceptions here. Remember, your mission is to beat hoarding. If some mistakes occur along the way, it wouldn't be the end of the world. Because your goal is to beat hoarding, not to be devoid of mistakes. Really shifting, what's your priority? Decide which mistake you'll make. An example is throwing away something you would normally hang on to. Just try it out. Then write a specific prediction about how you're going to feel about getting rid of that stuff. And it could be, Earl, if I get rid of this particular saw or wrench or food item, when I need it, I'm not going to have it. And then I will be out of sorts. Now take a brave step and make that purposeful error. Put it out, try it out. Acknowledge that you are actually making this stuff. I wouldn't normally get rid of this stuff, but I'm actually going to do it. I'm making this, and call it a mistake. I'm going to make this mistake on purpose. Examine what happens subsequent to throwing it out. Does the bad outcome really happen? And then I hear people say, yes, I first start feeling that tingling in my fingers, then I start feeling my jaw tightening, and I know I'm getting anxious. I feel that anxiety coming on. Then you ask yourself, I knew because I predicted I will feel this way when I got rid of that stuff. Because I'm in control of what happens to me, how I behave, right? Because you're doing it purposefully. And then you ask yourself through a series of prompts, was the outcome as bad as it was? And even if you start feeling that anxiety, we go back to that question of that downward concept of, can I recover? Have I recovered? I've done this before. I've recovered. I felt anxious before. I'm still here. I'm still standing. I know what anxiety feels like. I know the initial signs. I felt anxious. I am able to deal with this anxiety because I made a purposeful decision to get rid of that stuff. And that's the testing concept. And sometimes it will take testing that out repeatedly to get to that place where you are able to anticipate the bad outcome and you're able to prepare yourself for actually sitting with it and being mindful and going through that process. And Melody says, being vulnerable, my biggest need area to declutter is my closet. I feel that if I give away all the smaller clothes, I'm going to give out myself ever losing weight. As if I'm keeping them to motivate me. No, it's not working. If I give them away, I'm giving away my dream. I always say, does it take 10 dresses from when you were 20 in your best shape to remind you that you are capable of actually getting to a healthier state? Because the reality is this, and this is where we challenge that concept. Maybe if you hold on to all 10, if you're able to fit yourself in 9 of those dresses 6 months from now, it only takes not fitting into 1 that make it all not worthwhile, correct? Oftentimes, if you kind of hold on to 10 and you fit into 9, it's the 1 that you don't fit into that reminds you of all those unhealthy feelings. Whereas if you hold on to 1 and you're able to fit into it or not, it's easier to then rid yourself of it and be like, you know what? Maybe it's just, in many regards, you can tell yourself, it was just cut differently in the 80s. Right? I wasn't fully developed physically. There's so much you can actually talk yourself through and process. It's important to know that. And I speak to that, Sarah. It says, yes, it would be better to reward yourself with new clothes when you do lose weight. So you actually can reward yourself as you move progressively towards a goal that you're striving for. Good idea. So beliefs about responsibility, and I want to make sure we get through them. Feeling irresponsible, bad, or wasteful when confronted with a decision to discard something. And that often happens to people. You know, if I get rid of this and someone could have used it, one of my friends could have used it, I'm a terrible person, I'm irresponsible. It's a trap in many regards. Maybe I can fix it, or if I must get rid of it, it must go to a good home. I need to acquire it because a loved one may like it, want it, or need it. But then you find out, you know, none of your loved ones want it because it's been in a pile for 6 months. So if your feelings of being wasteful, irresponsible, or bad about discarding an item considered fixable, then that was highly unlikely or possible. Oftentimes, the item just collects dust in your home because loved ones didn't want it or need it. Here is where you use the downward form to clarify and challenge the veracity of that thinking. Is it my responsibility to hold on to things for someone else, even if they're my loved ones? Do they see this item with the same value or concepts that I do? No. I always say a wrench is a wrench, but it's not a wrench to everybody in that sense. Someone may see it, I don't want to have to, you know, I think of it, the wrenches you hold on to that gives your hands calluses. Now you have ones that you can operate with batteries. It's just different. The utility of it has changed. So it's important to look at beliefs about responsibility. Is it your job to make sure every item goes to a good home? No. That's why I always say Goodwill has that lovely responsibility, and they are actually skilled and knowledgeable doing it. If you give it to Goodwill, they can make sure it goes to a good home. No pun intended. That's why the name is associated. It's Goodwill. So even if you feel that sense of responsibility, you can delegate that responsibility to an authority that is designed to do so. Goodwill will find a good home for it. And sometimes when you have that possession and you go through that process of need and want, of discerning that, it may guide you as to whether or not a loved one will want this item you keep holding on to. Because I always ask people, have you asked your loved one whether or not they want this item? From the time you've been holding on to it? No, maybe the time is now. You know, my niece, do you really want all of these, whatever I'm holding on to? They may tell you unequivocally, thank you, but no thank you. Matter of fact, I've got 5 of those already. You may not know. Helps you make that decision. So you test it out again. It's important to do that. You know, I think of act irresponsibly in a small way, nothing life-changing. You know, decide how you will act irresponsibly. Throw away something that is fixable, or moving something from the recycling to the garbage can. That's one of those things that I had a difficulty with doing. I'll just confess right away. My wife is a stickler for what goes into the recycle and what goes into the garbage. You know, I come from an English background where we call things 2 things. It's either rubbish or garbage. And most of the times we use a single word, rubbish, because we're lazy. We don't want to ship things out. We just throw everything in the rubbish can, right? But there's a reality, yes, there's an authority oftentimes that makes us, you know, make those demarcations. But think of it. You move it from the garbage thing to the recycle, even though it's a recyclable. Just for a moment. Just do it. Write a specific prediction. Now, for me, my wife is going to get on my tail, so I know that. That's a prediction. I want to get on my tail, I'll have some concerns about it, but it may be different for people. Go ahead and do the deed. Move it. Does the bad outcome happen? And even if my wife rags on me for a few hours, I can tell her, listen, I'm trying a new behavior. I'm trying to change. I'm trying to manage the situation. Would you just stick with me while I go through this process here? Because you can always, you know, in that particular case, if you try, you can move it back 24 hours after, right? You can take it out of the recycle can, put it back in the garbage can. What you're trying to establish is that you can tolerate that. Because you ask yourself, was it difficult to recover even if the predicted outcome occurred? The reality is you are able to tolerate it, but you have to test it out. So be unafraid to make mistakes and test out making small irresponsible acts to give yourself a sense of what you can tolerate and what you're able to cope with. Now, this is a biggie, attachment to possessions. We've talked about this earlier in the training. A sense of attachment to an item can be a powerful motivator to hang on to it. People keep stuff because they develop an impractical and sometimes unreasonable emotional attachment to it. The problem is people who hoard have this sense of attachment to so many items that they don't feel able to reduce clutter in their dwelling. It's not just one item, it becomes 6 and 10 and 50, and before you know it, you've lost count. And you have to test out that concept. Distance yourself from the item for a week and examine your predictions about the outcome. And we've talked about that a little earlier. Put it in a trunk, give it to a loved one, see what happens. Process it, test it out. And ask yourself, how much do you actually enjoy this item? Are you keeping it for sentimental reasons? If so, does it truly make you happy to have it? And the only way you can make that distinction is to actually distance yourself from that object and really test that process of that emotional connection to it. Because we can become emotionally attached to everything in our hemisphere. It's just not practical for us to maintain that. Now, you can actually maintain an emotional attachment to an item and not possess it. Because I ask people the same question. How many of us have been, well, I'm just going to put it out there. How many of us have been part of a team that won, or in some instances brought second place or third, right? Trophies for all those. But it was a joint effort. And everyone basically won the trophy. But the trophy stays at the high school or the middle school. But we still maintain an emotional attachment to that item. What we can certainly do is every time there's an alumni association, we go through the halls and we do what? We point to that trophy and we say, yes, indeed. I helped win that. That is mine, that is ours. Those are the same kind of opportunities. Sometimes if that drum set that you're holding on for that nephew that never materialized, you can actually give it a place where someone can use it, and you can actually go and see it being used and enjoy the benefit of it being used. Many ways of doing that. Identity-related beliefs is the next. Attaching a sense of who you are and whom you want to be to that possession. And we talked about that earlier. Getting stuck on the initial steps. And we talk about it, a good example, I think, Debbie gave, where someone is holding on to a set of painting materials and tools with the concept that if I have all these painting stuff, then people will see me as an artist. And I will see myself as an artist, right? I hold on to the old t-shirts. I see myself as being fit and staying in that mode when I'm 20. Defining yourself by your possessions. The challenge with that is you get stuck on the initial step, just having it, the tools, never getting to actually the process of using it, the action parts of the process. Because what makes a handyman? Is it the tools that he possesses, or is how handy he is? What he does? What makes a handyman is that he can fix stuff. That's what makes a handyman. So he can have a whole, storage facility of tools. If he's not using it, he can't be defined as a handyman. You are not an artist if you're not producing art. You can have easels and paints and brushes. You have to produce art. So it's about moving, not being stuck in the possession of the instrument, but using that instrument to produce an outcome, and a product is what defines us, right? I am not an entrepreneur simply because I have 50 suits. I actually have to be doing business. That's part of it. So that's important to have that concept really clear and defined in your mind. The need to redefine your identity without the clutter. That's critical in that sense. The point is, even though many people's identity is tied to what they do, it goes beyond having the tools. You must accomplish the tasks associated with the profession and related identity. Like I said, a handyman does the maintenance or fixing of stuff, not merely possessing the associated tools. So really ask yourself, whom do you want to be? What do you want your life to be about? Do you want your life to be about the possessions? Or do you want your life to be about the product from utilizing those things? Enjoying, having a value, an immediate association with that item. Wearing that t-shirt if it's important to you, and if it doesn't fit. You have to ask yourself, where do I value? Do I need it? Do I want it? So really looking in terms of the identity-related beliefs are critical. Because oftentimes, when our world seems so out of control, that's when we hold on to a level of control internally. Oftentimes, we underestimate our memory. We try to put things in place, worrying incessantly about forgetting something important. And then what do we resort to? Leaving things in sight to cue memory, right? We want to keep this here so that I can remember this stuff. It results in clutter piling up and things not being found. The opposite of what our intentions are. And instead of having memory strategies, we have the unintended consequence. So those things that we use as a memory cue then becomes memory impairing, because instead of it being in a place where we can remember, it's under a pile of stuff that we can't figure where things are. So it's important to have that element. Make sure that we're not underestimating our memory, and we use the things that we need to when our memory requires it. So the way of testing that out is to try to see if your memory is good enough to find the things that you need when you put them out of sight. So what I'm going to suggest is that you pick 5 things you might forget and put them somewhere out of sight. Something that makes logical sense, though. So if you're going to put letters, put them in a drawer so that you have an association between letters in a drawer or letters in a specific cabinet or a filing cabinet. Write down where you put that item or those items. Wait 24 hours and see if you can find those items. Now, if you found those items, it means that you have underestimated your memory. So you now have a sense that, okay, my memory is working very well. I don't have to keep things in sight in order for me to know where they are. But if you are unable to find those 5 items, you may have memory issues and you may actually need to use some memory helping strategies. So that's just a great way of really discerning exactly where you are in terms of your process. And what are those memory promoting strategies? And that's where we look at utilizing the right skills. So when we talk about the right skills, we're talking about effective and efficient organizational strategies. And we spoke about that in early chapters. We talk about really implying strategies that will help you rely less on your memory and more on your external structure. Remember chapter 9, where you listed all the categories and locations for the items you wanted to save? Go back to that list and use it as a guide to sorting. Because you don't want to overtax your memory, particularly regarding paper items. What we suggest with paper items, since they're a major source of anxiety, is to really put them in a single place, like a filing cabinet, alphabetical order, so you know where things are, or you put them in a single stuff so you have a single access point. So remember to go back to your tool that you use about decision making, about categories and locations that will help you discern where things are. Make sure you are looking at it from that perspective. Now, beliefs about control is probably the ultimate one. The more the world seems out of control, the more you feel that sense of, I need to control it by hanging on to things. And it's a catch-22, because the more, no one, you quickly think of, no one has the right to tell me what to do with my stuff. And oftentimes, the more people tell you to organize and sort your stuff, the more you hold on to that concept of my right to autonomy, to decision making. No one should tell me what to do. The challenge with that perception is, or that belief is, the more you dig in your heels, the more stuck you are likely to become. Because if no one should tell you what to do with your stuff, but you're having excessive clutter, then the more you actually pile stuff up, and you're less likely to be able to have the access and utility to that item. So it's really a self-sabotaging kind of approach. So what's important here is to really discern, what do you truly control? And what you control is what you believe and how you act based on those beliefs. Because are you really in control of your possessions, or your possessions are in control of you? And does letting go of a possession really mean that you lose control? Or are you trying to make sure everyone else doesn't win? And are you winning by holding on to the items? So you really have to ask yourself some very clear questions. Control is in your ability to make those decisions based on a feeling that drives a positive action that helps you move towards your goal of reducing hoarding. That's what you want to control. Is this act, is this feeling, is this thought driving that behavior that gets me closer to my goal of limiting and moderating my collection and possessions of things? Overthinking or confusing yourself is another challenge in that regard. If we look at a million ways of discerning whether or not this stuff is useful, it can prevent us from making the decision to get rid of it or to sort it. If we establish burdensome rules for discarding our items, it has to be in the perfect place, it has to be at a specific time, it limits our ability to make a decision in that moment. If we have too many categories for how we sort things, we're also limiting ourselves. So what's critical and important here is developing the right skills, speeding up the decision-making process. And we do that in a clear, defined way. We actually get a kitchen timer, We put it in with an alarm. We figure out exactly how long it takes to make a decision. Then we set the timer for half of that time that we initially did. And then we try to make that decision again. And we do that until we get it down to where we're making that decision in about a minute or less. And it often takes a lot of practice. But what we have found, the evidence has shown, is that we can make a decision within a minute, and that's the most feasible timeline for making a good decision based on facts and the right actual perception and feeling that guides healthy behavior. Then we experiment with breaking some rules. We've talked about that before, and reduce the number of categories so that our paper is in a single place, organized well, so we're not looking for 50 different items in 50 different places. When we're taking on the bad guys, we've talked about that, be aware of which bad guy affects your progress. Is it overthinking? Is it those unhealthy thoughts or feelings? And train yourself to react differently and gain control over your hoarding problems. Recognize the cognitive distortion, think it through, and then do the trying out practice to make sure that you are able to cope, you're able to manage that emotion, you know that what you're predicting as a negative outcome, and you're able to tolerate it even if you have that negative outcome. Remember, nobody can impose beliefs on you. It's always you who in the last instance can permit a belief to be true or not. Your belief is driven by you. Your belief drives the way you feel, drives the way you act, determines the impact on your aspirations and your goal of reducing hoarding. Remember, you have to reward yourself for your progress. Don't be afraid. Make sure you're sticking with your plan of rewarding yourself, regardless of what that is. Don't forget your practice muscles. By now, you should be keeping it up, well-conditioned. You should be at the 60-minute mark where you're actually engaging in the sorting practices for about 60 minutes, because you're in the latter phase of action. That's where you need to be. And if you're not, you need to go back to the steps and kind of revisit those concepts. So I want to take this opportunity to ask you, as usual, to really complete the evaluation, and helps us really determine how we best modify this training to best suit your needs. So I'm going to quickly ask you if you can take a few seconds. I'm going to put the evaluation in the chat and ask if you take a few minutes to just complete this evaluation. But I also want to quickly, and I know we're running short on time, if you have questions, I want you to take the opportunity to shoot those questions now. What I'm also going to do is to give you the link to the learning applications that we talked about and some of the instruments that we use. I want to make sure that you have those available to you. So they're all there. So certainly if you have questions, it's the time to ask, but certainly if you can, certainly help us with completing the evaluation. Now, the learning application for the next month's meeting is to share or try to do you believe form. The advantages and disadvantages worksheet in a downward arrow form, really practicing in a real environment, and you provide some feedback when we meet next as to how helpful they were or whether or not they were challenging. Our next meeting is December 20th, and it's the same time, and it's going to cover our final chapter, maintaining your success. And remember, you're already registered, you use the same link. I want to thank you. We appreciate your time and attention and participation. And remember, today's webinar is hosted by the Washington Healthcare Authority. And we'd like to remind you that the slides will be forwarded to you in the recording as well. And don't forget to check out Foundational Community Supports newsletter for all things FCS and upcoming training events. Please, you're quite welcome. I'm going to end the recording, but I truly appreciate your participation.